Introduction now. I'm Amy Robinson. I'm one of the organizers with the Occupy Santa Rosa Free Schools Working Group. The other organizers who are here are Maggie and Linda, who'll be welcoming people. So if you haven't been to one of our events before, welcome to the Occupy Santa Rosa Free School. This is our first indoor event since February. We've done 13 teach-ins, a 4-week book club, and conversation circles on economic justice themes, all spring and summer, all in Courthouse Square. So this is kind of a new experience for us, having a roof. And Melissa's right there. I want to thank the Share Exchange. And Melissa wanted a few minutes to say a little bit about the Share Exchange and where we are right now.
Yeah. So welcome so much to our space. I'm going to stand here just because it's easier. The space that you're in is brand new to us, which is part of the Share Exchange. We also occupy the building directly next door at 531. And the space that you're in right now, it's a co-working center. So people are members, and during the day they come and use our space as a communal office. So people are sharing the physical roof, which is part of the new economy that we need to move towards, as opposed to everyone having their own little individual cubbyhole. They're sharing the space. And then we lease out the space in the evenings towards community events or consultations, appointments, things like that. And then next door at 531 5th, we have the Made Local Marketplace, which is a storefront for local artists here in Sonoma County. We have over 260 vendors who sell arts and crafts and fine arts there. So we're open from 9 to 7 during the holiday hours. So on another day, make sure you stop by. It's a great spot for any holiday or gift needs. We also have a lot of practical items and food items. And so just some housekeeping items. The bathrooms are right down here at the end of the hall. The women's is the first door, the men's is the second. And then the exit's the main front. I'll be here the entire night, so if you need any assistance or anything like that, I'll be kind of hanging out doing some paperwork. This is literally our 3rd day in this space. We just expanded, so welcome so much. Yeah.
What's your name?
My name's Melissa. So I'm the event coordinator and the member services here at the Share Exchange. This is the co-working space. We call it the Share Space. And next door is the Made Local Marketplace. So welcome so much. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I also wanted to let you know about a few things that Free School is working on. Next week, the same time, we're starting 6 weeks of a reading group, and we're going to be reading Starhawk's book that came out at the end of last year called The Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups. If you don't know who she is a longtime environmental and social justice activist based in the Bay Area. And this is kind of the first of its kind, like a whole book devoted to how to really facilitate the development of empowering, collaborative, participatory democracy, democratic structures for social change. So we're starting that next week, and we are going to occupy the mall. Our first meeting is going to be in the Santa Rosa Plaza, upstairs above Starbucks. They have this super comfy lounge space, and it's really quiet, and it's free. So we're the Free School, so that's where we're going to be next week, 7 o'clock, and then we'll hopefully we'll see. We'll hopefully have a different venue for the 5 next weeks.
Let me just interject there. So if anybody has any ideas of a space that might be accommodate us, that we're looking for a space for,
like we said,
after the mall next week, we can look for a space.
Oh, and the books here, I have 4 here available for sale. They're $20 each, and they're also at Copperfields, Montgomery Village. They're $25, but because we get a 20% book club discount there, they're $20. So if you mention Occupy Santa Rosa Book Club, you can get it there. And Starhawk is going to be coming in late January to do an event with us. We're going to be doing something called a learning cluster, a direct democracy learning cluster. So we're going to be showing a film 1 week, having a panel discussion 1 week, doing a reading group 1 week, and then having an open conversation at the end, all on the theme about direct democracy and why it's so important to social change movements, and why Occupy is a democracy movement and not just an economic justice movement, why these two are so important. And then Occupy Santa Rosa in general, I just wanted to let you know, we are still having general assemblies, 5 o'clock every Thursday in Courthouse Square. Everybody's always welcome to our open decision-making forum. And October 14th, we're having our 1-year anniversary celebration. So it's almost an entire year since we kicked off. We have a full page ad in the Bohemian, right there. Brianna's showing it. And yeah, I have that too. 2 o'clock in City Hall, which is where we started last year. So come join us for an anniversary parade, and there'll be sign making next week at the Peace and Justice Center at 5 o'clock if you're interested. And OccupySantaRosa.org is our calendar, our website. Our calendar has all our information on it, so just keep checking that. There's a lot going on. I won't go into it all tonight. I will just go ahead and introduce David. This is David Walls. We have been wanting to do this teach-in for months and months and months, so we're so happy it's finally happening. He is a professor emeritus of sociology from Sonoma State University and on the Leadership Council of the North Bay Organizing Project. And we are very lucky to have him come share
Thank you very
his knowledge
much.
with us.
I'm delighted to be here at long last. This is a class that I've usually done over 6 to 8 sessions, 6 to 8 weeks, a 2-hour session every week. So compressing it down into 1 2-hour session is required some compromises. It's not a history of all U.S. social movements. It's taking up the topics that you see on your brief list there, which focuses on the videos. And primarily, you'll find that the illustrative material that I have on video tonight is mostly dealing with the civil rights movement. There's a certain continuity to that's probably helpful. It's also some of the best material. But accept that as a compromise. To give you a little more, I have a brief bibliography, a chronology here of U.S. social movements. Perhaps you could pass it out at this point. Thank you. That, again, focuses first on the civil rights movement, second on the women's movement, first phase, women's suffrage, and second phase, the women's liberation movement, and also the labor movement to a limited extent. It doesn't integrate in the environmental movement. I'm going to have to get around to that one of these days. But the idea here is to have a discussion about this as we go along, because I think these are topics certainly that have been challenging within Occupy and within most social movements. These are questions that come up. The first 3, organization, windows of opportunity, narratives, and framing, reflect 3 of the major schools of thought about social movements. Organization, the school that's come to be known as resource mobilization. You know, organizers like to say that power comes from organized people and organized money. Those are resources, and resource mobilization looked at that aspect of it. I should mention, by the way, that most of these theory of social movements that we'll be talking about here have been developed since the 1960s, particularly since the development of the civil rights movement. And partly before that, including way before that, into the 1800s, concern with social movements was mostly a conservative preoccupation. And they were worried about crowds and panics and things of that sort. Like one great title from the 1800s is the Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. But that's a great title. It's mostly about financial panics, but related subjects. Another book, The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon, was concerned about the rising socialist movement in Europe. Even in the United States in the 50s and 60s, a fascinating best-selling book by a self-educated longshoreman from San Francisco, you're nodding, Eric Hoffer, yeah. The True Believer, again concerned with irrationality in movements. But that didn't seem to match what people saw in the civil rights movement and in movements that followed from that. So this whole new school of thought developed, looking at organization. That was refined a bit by looking at what was called political opportunity structure, which I like to call windows of opportunity. And then there's a third view that went back to the creativeness that people have, on narratives and framing, people deciding for themselves what kind of new identities they're forging, what they're going to take to their, how they're going to work for social change. Now, do these questions engage you at all? Has organization been an issue in Occupy, for example? You laugh. How has it been? The question.
I think it's gotten more organized, but I remember like sort of the was it storming, forming, and norming in the beginning? Like, yeah. I mean, when we kind of came together and figured out, you know, how do we do this, like, in a kind of democratic fashion, and everybody shares their passions, and nobody's leading.
Yeah.
So organization, you know.
So how to organize is always an issue. But organizing, I like this quote from A. Philip Randolph, who we'll learn more about in a minute, who was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. At the banquet table of life, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take and keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. If you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization. Okay, so starting with that as our watchword here. Just a couple of other quick points about social movements. I'm sure you're all familiar with Maggie Mead's famous little statement, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Well, under one condition, I would say, and that is that small group of people become a very large group of people. It almost always requires that. So we need to organize. Well, what are social movements? For a simple definition, Dick Flax from the University of California, Santa Barbara gives us simple: the collective efforts of some duration and organization using non-institutional means to bring about social change. Institutional means here means sort of politics as usual. Okay, well, there's a more complicated definition. Let's skip over that. Functions of organizations. Why are organizations important? Among the things that they do are developing long-range strategies, sustaining personal networks, mobilizing them, testing tactics, winning victories, consolidating gains, that's important, defending advances against the inevitable backlash, summing up experiences, passing on lessons, holding the movement together through the doldrums, and there are inevitably doldrums, because movements have a kind of a cyclical nature. Here's an interesting sort of popular description of the cycle of social movement, sort of an 8-stage cycle that an activist named Bill Moyer, this is not Bill Moyers of PBS fame, but Bill Moyer, who is a peace activist from San Francisco who died several years ago. But for years he had these little newspapers that he would go around and do workshops with. They're sort of tabloid-like things that contained this analysis and others. And finally, his friends helped him get a book together called Doing Democracy. And I would recommend that to you if you want a book that sort of elaborates the scheme. It's the usual scheme of emergence, ascendance, and then gradual decline, and then maybe rebirth of this cycle again, elaborated a little bit more. It has one really interesting point, perception of failure, the 5th cycle here. When people perceive failure when they're really winning, but they're too short-sighted to imagine that. And that gets people frustrated, and it pushes them to radical positions, doing things that seem extreme by others' conventional standards, and often subvert and undercut the movement itself. He was very acute, I think, to develop that, and that's worth looking at. Okay, yes, yeah.
In Starhawk's book that we're going to be reading, in the introduction, she actually quotes Bill Moyer talking about that exact stage that you were talking about.
Oh, good.
So.
Good. That's something that you stay around long enough and you will definitely be frustrated by that. I want to start this by looking at a case which doesn't seem to involve much organization at all on a popular level, and that's the Montgomery bus boycott, which you all know something about, right? Who do we associate that with that? Who's the
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, okay. And what's the popular story? What's the simple story about Rosa Parks?
Tired lady won't give up her seat.
Oh,
White man.
To a white man.
she's going home, she's tired, she's this seamstress lady, sits down on the bus, doesn't want to get up. Okay. Rosa Parks sat down and the whole world stood up, Pete Seeger saying, right? Okay. What's wrong with that story?
It's not true. She wasn't alone.
Well, yeah, just a couple of things that might.
It was planned by a whole organization.
Yeah, there was a plan for doing this, yeah.
She's a trained activist. She trained at Highlander.
She was at the Highlander Center, about which we can say more. Yeah, let's look at this. See how many elements of organization come into this story. If I can just get this going here. This is copied from two programs.
On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger.
The front seats were occupied, and there's one man, a white man, standing. And at this point, the driver asked us to stand up and let him have those seats. And when none of us moved at his first words, he said, "Y'all make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats." And when the policeman approached me, one of them spoke and asked me if the driver had asked me to stand. I said, yes. He said, "Why don't you stand up?" I said, "I don't think I should have to stand up." And I asked him, I said, "Why do you push us around?" He said, "I do not know, but the law is the law and you're under arrest."
Mrs. Parks was formerly my secretary in the NAACP in the local branch for about 12 years. She also worked with me when I was state president of the NAACP. And she also assisted me in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And if there ever was a woman who was dedicated to the cause, Rosa Parks was that woman.
This was not the first time a black person had defied the bus segregation in Montgomery. It was not Mrs. Parks' first time. It was her first arrest. E.D. Nixon went to the police station to bail her out.
As Miss Parks, I said, with your permission, we can break down segregation on the bus with your case. I said, I'm convinced that we can do it. I said, if I wasn't convinced, I wouldn't bother about it. She asked her mother what she thought about it. She said, I'll go along with Mr. Nixon. I asked her husband, he said, I'll support it. So that's fine.
E.D. Nixon and other black leaders called for a one-day bus boycott. In some cities, it would have been impossible to organize 40,000 people in 2 days. But Black Montgomery had a core of activists in the Women's Political Council, and they distributed these boycott notices all over the city.
I called every person who was at every school and every place where we had planned to be at that, have somebody at that school or wherever it was at a certain time, that I would be there with material for them to disseminate. I didn't go to bed that night. I cut those stencils. I ran off 35,000 copies.
But the bus passed right down in front of my house, you know. And I got up to see it, and several buses passed. I was late for work because I was trying to see how many buses were empty, and they were totally empty.
The one-day boycott was a success. That night, a mobilized black community turned out for a meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church and voted unanimously to continue the boycott.
The preachers were preaching as I came in. I was about 2 minutes late coming in, and they were preaching. And that audience was so on fire that the preacher would get up and say, "You want your freedom?" And they'd say, "Yeah, well, I want my freedom. Are you for what we're doing?" "Yeah, go ahead, go ahead."
overwhelmingly. I don't know if there was one vote that said, no, don't continue. The people wanted to continue that boycott. They had been touched by the persecution, the humiliation that many of them had endured on buses. And they voted for it unanimously. And that meant thousands of people.
You see, when I first started fighting, I was fighting to keep so that the children who came behind me wouldn't suffer the same thing I suffered. Then the night of the bus boycott on December the 5th, I told the people that I'd been fighting like that for all these years. I said, the night I changed my mind, I said, hell, I want to enjoy some of this stuff myself.
The keynote speaker at Holt Street Church was a new preacher in town, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was only 26 and was almost unknown outside his own congregation. King wasn't sure he should accept when his fellow ministers and other leaders asked him to head the new Montgomery Improvement Association and the boycott. But they wanted him in part because he was new in Montgomery.
Reverend King was a young man, a very intelligent young man. He had not been young long enough for the city fathers to put their hand on him.
In Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, a black woman, Rosa Parks, was arrested for not moving
slightly repetitive here, going into this other source.
E.D. Nixon began calling community leaders to gather support for a bus boycott.
The first person I called was Martin Luther King, and he said, "Bro, Nixon, let me think about it a while and call me back." So I went on and called 18 people and called them back. He said, "Yeah, bro, Nixon, I decided I'm going to go along with you." I said, "I'm glad you decided to go along with Reverend King." I said, "Your church is the only church right downtown." And I told 18 other people to meet at your church this evening at 3 o'clock. And what kind of and then people coming up to your church for a meeting of this kind, and you want that.
That night, the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed, with 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. at its head.
I called Mr. Randolph at his office and I told him what had just happened, and I had been elected treasurer. I said, "It's my responsibility to raise some money." I said, "I need your help." He said, "All right." And he said, "I'll pass the word around, and wherever you go, then somebody will know about it. So it won't be no problem you being able to talk to people." And he did that. And everywhere I got, I was received. And make a long story short, in 4 months' time, I raised $97,000 a day, 5 automobiles. And I've done it solely because of the influence of April Randolph, who knew his way around.
I'm so glad I'm fighting for my right.
What that meant was that Randolph would call chapters of locals of the auto workers in the Midwest, and he'd go around to auto worker locals and
Through the winter, spring, and summer, Montgomery's black residents stayed off the buses. They stayed off the buses for nearly a year. Some walked miles to get to work or to church. Others formed complicated carpooling networks. That November, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on Montgomery's bus lines was illegal.
If I had never met Randolph, I'd have been probably like the average person in my city. What's wrong with whatever was happening, because I wouldn't know no way to turn. And after I met Randolph, I learned how to deal with these problems. The representatives union, and if I'd done the thing wrong, and he called me, want to know when I have a long day, and I tell him, "I need Jim off, I need to talk to you." And he'd sit down and talk to you like he was his son, and explain these things to you. And because of that, if it had not been for Randolph, it wouldn't have been E.D. Nixon. If it hadn't been E.D. Nixon, you'd have never known Martin Luther King.
Was Randolph an African-American man?
yes, he was, yeah, we'll see a little more about him in a minute. He was a black leader headquartered in New York who was the organizer and then president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the only all-black union, part of the railroad brotherhoods. And as a result of that, he was also a member, they were part of the AFL's American Federation of Labor, and he was gradually stayed with that until he was on the executive board, at which time, as I think this next piece will show, he worked on all sorts of issues of discrimination in the unions, set himself at odds with George Meany, who was then the head of the AFL-CIO. But you see all of those interconnected networks there. You see, and it's not only Highlander Center that Rosa Parks was connected with. She was a local NAACP youth leader. Ella Baker was a traveler from NAACP and was a mentor to Rosa Parks. There were a multitude of connections. They had these weren't strong connections. These were weak connections. Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in some of his work. It's having weak connections that can be very important to you. There were other cities that tried to do bus boycotts in the South. New Orleans is one. I think there was maybe I don't know if it's in Alabama or Georgia or Florida. But they didn't have the kind of organization, they didn't have the unity, they didn't have these national connections that they had there in Montgomery. And Montgomery was a tough place. That was the cradle of the Confederacy, they liked to consider themselves. So that was no pushover place. But even there, Rosa Parks had been a voter since the late 1940s. In the cities in the South, there were some blacks who managed to get registered to vote. There was unity between, and this is a tricky question, between the middle class, as so to speak, and working class blacks. E.D. Nixon probably had a second or third grade education, maybe. He was not part of the local black elite, though he was through his position, but he was not part of that educated group that was at the college where Joanne Robinson taught and where she snuck in and used the mimeograph machine all night to write up her leaflets. So you see this network of contacts that they got in there through being part of these different organizations, the NAACP, the sleeping car porters, really strengthened their abilities to do things. Even with that, you'll notice that one of the ironies is they didn't win because of the boycott. The city was willing to bankrupt the bus company until the Supreme Court made the decision to desegregate, and they just gave up at that point. But the importance of the bus boycott was that it showed that black communities in the South were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to combat segregation.
What year was it that the Supreme Court made that decision?
What
year did the Supreme Court make that decision? Is that 55? 56?
Around there, yeah. 55, 56. Pardon?
54. No, because the boycott was 55, they said.
Yeah, I think it was right at the end of 55, at the beginning.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
One, didn't they have some grandfather clause to keep blacks from getting registered to vote? And I don't know, how did Rosa Parks get past that? And also, why were the buses empty if colored people, or I don't know what the correct term is, if African Americans are a minority, then wouldn't there still be plenty of whites on the bus?
They had cars, they could afford cars.
Oh.
And there were a lot of black people in Montgomery. There were 40,000 at least. So it was a sizable population.
How did the people who were African American and voted back then get around the grandfather clause they used to have?
I don't know. Maybe they don't. Maybe that was something. The elites, gave way a little bit to educated people. I mean, they had people who were professors at this. What was it, Alabama Colored Teachers College or whatever it was called at that time. So they gave a little bit of ground, but not enough to really cause them any loss of power. Well, let's look at this question of windows of opportunity. There are structural constraints of when movements can advance. Let's see if we can take a great example here of.
David, might you be able to turn it up just a smidge?
The sound,
time?
yeah.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of them.
Believed in Mr. Randolph. Nobody could judge me, especially against the slave Philip.
Economic and political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway. And just as
throughout the 20th century, A. Philip Randolph stood at the leading edge of social and political change. In the 1950s, he challenged union bosses, demanding equality for black workers.
What we do know that
A. Philip Randolph did more than anyone to set the agenda for the modern civil rights movement.
In the 40s, he faced down 2 presidents to end segregation in defense industries and in the military. In the 20s and 30s, he led black workers in a fight against a powerful corporation.
the very nature of the struggle on the part of labor and minority.
And in 1919, the Attorney General called him the most dangerous Negro in America.
In 1940 and 41, the Roosevelt administration was gearing up for World War II, mobilizing the country, transforming the defense industries. There was a great deal of political conflict with isolationists on the right, with some elements of the American labor movement on the left. It was in this context, in the spring of 1941, that Randolph saw a moment of opportunity in which he could make a demand of the administration for the integration of the defense industries, for jobs for black Americans in the defense industries, and he would have the most leverage, the most power at that particular moment.
Randolph consulted with his close friend Milton Webster as they traveled by train to visit Brotherhood locals in the South.
Brother Randolph said to me, he says, you know, Webb, we got to do something about these jobs around here. And of course, knowing Brother Randolph, I said, well, here comes something else. Well, he says, I think we ought to get 10,000 Negroes and march down Pennsylvania Avenue and protest. What do you think about that? I said, I think it's all right. Where are you going to get the 10,000 Negroes? Exactly, we can get them.
Trying to find some work to do. Had a nerve to tell me, black boy, nothing here for you.
Randolph used local Brotherhood offices to organize support for his march on Washington. Randolph demanded an end to segregation in the military. He called for defense industries and government to stop discriminating against black workers.
I shall never forget when there was so much excitement, so much interest on the part of the young people. They were enlisting people to go, they were having meetings, they were revving up their enthusiasm, and they felt that this was something really worthwhile.
He called mass meetings in polo grounds and Soldiers Field and other ballparks around the country. Leaflets were distributed in mass, tens of thousands. A. Philip Randolph will speak. He says, the Congress of the United States and the President must see 5,000, 10,000, 25,000 Negroes congregated on the lawn of the White House in protest. And the mass audiences rose to their feet because this was something new. This was not a leader who would go in behind closed doors and try to make a deal. Here was a man who demanded, with the people behind him.
Concern grew over the prospect of thousands of black Americans marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. President Roosevelt asked Randolph to come to the White House.
The President made as his first comment. He said, Phil Randolph, we can't have 100,000 Negroes marching on Washington. If anything such as that were to occur, you wouldn't be able to manage them. You might have bloodshed and death. He said, now let us get on to business here and find out what can be done. So I said, well, Mr. President, what we're concerned about is jobs. Jobs in the munition industries, and we want to abolish discrimination against Negroes in the government, where there are many jobs. And he said, you indicating that the government discriminates against Negroes? But I said, it's one of the worst offenders. We talked at length, and finally he said that, well, what do you want me to do? I said, we want you to issue an executive order, abolishing discrimination in munition jobs and also in the government.
And Roosevelt could not take their chance that 25,000 people would be in Washington at a time when he was calling the United States the arsenal of democracy, which must keep Britain and France afloat as they carry the banner for freedom and liberty and justice and democracy. And then if 25,000 Negroes came to Washington, he would look like a fool.
He said, now, I'm going to have a committee set up here to study this question, but I want you to call off this march first. I said, that, Mr. President, I can't do. I said, as a matter of fact, the people wouldn't even follow me if I were to come out and call off the march, because they would consider that I had betrayed them. And he said, will you march against the President of the United States? I said, we have no other alternative.
Randolph was the master of the strategic bluff, or the tactical bluff, if you will. Maybe he couldn't have marched on Washington. Maybe there wouldn't have been 5,000, 10,000, 25,000 people there. Indeed, Walter White of the NAACP said later that they couldn't have had anybody in Washington because it was not organized. Randolph was bluffing. But Roosevelt did not know that.
6 days before the march, the President signed Executive Order 8802. It called for an end to discrimination in the federal government and defense industries. And it created, for the duration of the war, a Fair Employment Practices Commission.
This was a real confrontation between the black and white in the White House. It demonstrated the ability of the black masses to win a victory themselves, and it gave them a new spirit, new hope, new determination, and a belief in themselves.
Randolph's decision to cancel the march drew fire from a new generation of radicals, including Bayard Rustin. They complained that Roosevelt's order did not address the segregation of black soldiers and offered no job protection in peacetime.
People were upset because it meant you had to rely on Roosevelt's word, and Roosevelt did not have that much credibility among African Americans about anything. He had not demonstrated any great commitment to civil rights. He had not demonstrated any commitment at all to equal employment opportunities, certainly. And a piece of paper with Roosevelt's name on it didn't mean a whole lot to a lot of black people. And there were those black Americans, Bayard Rustin one of them, who wanted to in fact have a march to make the point more forcibly, to in fact demonstrate black American political power so they could get in fact even more.
Randolph defended his action. After the signing of the executive order, 1 million black Americans were added to the industrial workforce.
As a result of this order, immediately and dramatically, people began to feel good about it. People began to get the kinds of jobs that they were more entitled to. It was noticeable to me in the way in which their attitudes changed about themselves and about others around them. They felt good about themselves. Mr. Randolph made one of the greatest social and economic impacts on our lives without having to overturn anything. Such a dramatic, such an immediate effect that we begin to feel better, in fact, more loyal even to the country which had deprived us of so much for so long.
Pause there for a minute. What was it about that moment? Why was that the moment when Randolph had all that leverage? What was it about that?
I think it was because they were in like World War II and FDR was basically saying like America's the best and we've got your back, and he couldn't have like 20,000 people marching saying that America wasn't the best.
They were well down the road to the war, but the war hadn't started yet.
Okay.
This was before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. So that hadn't, after that, it probably would have been unpatriotic. He wouldn't have been able to get away with threatening this because the public sentiment would be against anybody getting in the way of the war effort. But they were far enough along that it was really important that they not have controversy and turmoil and this challenge to the United States reputation. So he had that historical moment just right there.
Well, they also probably needed workers.
And they needed workers, particularly when they started sending, when they recruited a lot of people, drafted people into the Army and sent them overseas. That's right. Women got jobs there too. The Fair Employment Practices Commission that was set up also worked to get women and, of course, Latinos and others jobs as well as African Americans.
I guess my question was, it seemed like they were really organized in many ways. He seemed like a powerful, leader, speaker,
yeah.
that it would be bluff. Like I wouldn't believe that they could get that many people and that couldn't happen. It didn't seem like,
I think they were able to bring at least some quantity. We can never know. But the NAACP was critical of it. Walter White was then the president. And, Thurgood Marshall, who later became the Supreme Court Justice, was the head of their legal department. He never thought, he didn't believe in demonstrations at all. He said, well, we'll work it all out in the courts. In Montgomery, he said, why are they doing all this bus boycott? See, we run it in the Supreme Court. They didn't win it with the bus boycott. But he's overlooking the, what it meant in a broader sense to Black America to do these things.
A. Philip Randolph was also working very closely with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, she was a good friend. She was a real person committed to Black advancement. Had her Black cabinet, so to speak, and it was part of her New Deal vision that got eroded as they got into the war and criticism. But you're right. Normally in this, if I had more time in this course, you'd go on and show what he did, how he won that integration of the armed services in 1948. Another immensely interesting moment when Truman is, he assumed office on Roosevelt's death in 1944, I believe.
45.
45, okay, and that's right, 45, and the next election then was 48, okay. Thank you. In 48, the Democrats, you remember, had a split of the right. Strom Thurmond led the right wing of the Democratic Party into this States' Rights Party. And on the left, Henry Wallace set up the Progressive Party. So there was Truman with his left wing and his right wing cut off. Didn't look in very good shape. He needed the Black vote. So, Randolph was there with another executive order for him to sign, integrating the armed services. And he signed that. And the Black vote in Illinois, California, Ohio, and Michigan carried Truman over Dewey. And he was reelected because of that maneuver, probably.
Do you feel like this, what we just saw, contradicts the sort of image of FDR as some sort of like hero of the people or great reformer? He's basically telling people, don't demonstrate because it'll make me look bad. Instead of like saying, yeah, you're right, it's probably a bad thing that black people are being lynched in my country. He's more concerned with don't come out in the streets because that'll make us look bad.
Politicians don't do anything unless the people tell them or make them. That's the way history is.
He's often quoted, probably incorrectly, as telling Randolph, "Go ahead and make me do it." You know, that old saying. I don't know whether he said it to Randolph or somebody else. But I mean, you have part of a point. But on the other hand, he was someone who was sensitive to that, and they knew as a sensitive politician they could box it in. The same with Truman. You don't expect. I don't expect presidents to do the right thing in the absence of pressure to do the right thing, popular pressure.
Can I ask just one more thing on that? Is that are we? I mean, is integrating the armed forces and campaigning to get more people to be part of the army, that seems like a victory for social movements?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at that. It was the most successful early example of integration. You know, this is well before Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This is 1948, and it was done slowly. It wasn't all done at first. Even in the Korean War, there was still separate black regiments. But it showed that with determination that you could, you know, integrate an institution as large as the Army successfully.
Yeah, if you look at the early civil rights movement, you'll see that it was populated by black men who had come out of the armed services. What that act did really was create a class of people. It wasn't a huge class by numbers, but it was a powerful class because they had more economic power than the poor blacks in the South. So that it was kind of the beginning of a black middle class in this country. And they came back with the knowledge of what it was like to live in an integrated society. And they weren't going to put up with anything less. And I think that was more important than the legal ramifications.
Edgar Evers, for example, was a veteran. The head editor of the Amsterdam News came down to cover the trial of the murderers of the young man from Chicago, the kid really from Chicago.
Emmett Till?
Emmett Till. He was a veteran. He was an officer in the Pacific, and he was just that we're not going to take it anymore, and that gave him a different experience. So you have to look at the contradictions of progress, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that, like, the participation in the military also provides a platform from which to speak about belonging and citizenship. And I know that immediately after the war in Guam, a lot of the Chamorros who had been colonial subjects, and well, they still are, but they had been officially a colony, they used that post-war moment in the same way to say, we participated in World War II, and you're trying to face down the Soviet Union and be this beacon of democracy. You can't, we're going to shame you into granting us some meaningful sort of citizenship.
You know, the whole
they still haven't achieved.
Anti-colonial revolt following World War II and following the establishment of the UN played a major role in pressuring the United States to change its mind. Why did the Supreme Court change separate is equal?
Well, I was in the service in 54, 55, 56, in the South. And we could not leave the base with a black man, and he could not leave the base with a white man. That the integration was integrated, but it wasn't there yet. And we sat and looked at each other like, here we are, friends, and we cannot be friends.
Outside the base.
Yeah, outside the base. So this was, this was 54, 55, 56. And early on, thank God it changed later, but...
Well, that was just at the time, just after following the
I was
Supreme Court
right in the middle of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think Randolph knew that he had that window of opportunity at those particular moments, or was he just lucky that way?
Well, he sensed it. I'm sure he did. I mean, there are people who, they're great leaders, like John L. Lewis of the mine workers, knew in 1935 that he could go out and organize the CIO, that he could walk out of the AFL convention, take the CIO and organize steel and auto and so forth.
Yeah, I had another question.
Yeah, go ahead. I've got to get this.
I have an opinion that this is not true equality to only allow women and people of other ethnicities into the manufacturing and the military. If you're doing it in part, even in part, because you're just desperate and need the workers. It's kind of like recently they said they allowed gays in the military, but I think they're just doing it because they're just taking whoever they can get. I think it's only true equality when you invite people that were normally victims of prejudice into the workforce or into other institutions out of a sense of wanting inclusion and not just we're desperate, we need as many people as we can get, so we'll allow it now. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, you would like people to have pure motives, and so would I, but we might accept less. We might accept slightly less.
In 54, 55, and 56, the law said one thing, reality said something else.
That's usually how laws are. Laws usually contradict reality.
Another great example that I'd like to use in this, which is a wonderful example, is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, in which you have this terrible disaster involving very young immigrant women, 144 or so killed in this fire in New York City, which sets in motion a whole wave of reform legislation in the state of New York, which is eventually used as the basis of a lot of the New Deal reforms. And the woman who becomes the first female and first Secretary of Labor was present that day in the street in New York watching the women fall from the 8th and 9th floor of the building, the Triangle building.
They didn't have fire escapes back then, did they?
Well, they did, but they only went up to the 6th floor, and they were in poor shape, and they collapsed with the crowd.
They were locked in.
Yeah, they were locked in because they didn't want union agents coming in talking to the women. Anyway, those kinds of disasters, wars, sometimes offer opportunities to movements. It's part of the irony of this whole business.
Things happen when they're not supposed to.